Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Recently I've been reading some newspaper reports, some stories out in the news about Japan, specifically that it's been experiencing its strongest GDP growth in more than a decade. As most of you will know, GDP growth is what's usually, this is the metric usually used by economists to measure whether a nation's economy is growing or not. And as many of you who are familiar with Japan will know, Japan's GDP and its economy has been somewhat stagnant for the best part of 20 years. After a big boom in the post-war years as the Japanese economy rebuilt following defeat in the Second World War, the economy grew at a phenomenal rate. Japan was held up as this great example of how to build an economy. There were many books came out, a famous one by Ezra Vogel, Japan is number one, and it was sort of seen as this great example to look towards, and from which other sort of capitalist, democratic economies could emulate. So naturally, after 2 decades effectively of stagnant economic growth or lack thereof, which came after the collapse of the bubble economy in the late 80s and early 90s, this idea that Japan's economy could be resurgent, these numbers showing that it's showing its greatest sort of quarter-on-quarter growth for years and years, would appear on the surface to be very good news and cause for celebration, and particularly so for Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. However, I wanted to talk today about the reality behind those numbers. I will say now that I'm not an economics expert. My academic experience is in Japan in general, so I can't talk too much about the actual numbers themselves and how those numbers are generated and how growth is generated. But I can talk a bit about everything that goes around those numbers and the policies that Abe has been using to try and generate growth since he came into office in late 2012. So the key concept to understand when considering the reality of this current growth spurt is Abe's signature economic policy, Abenomics, which, for those of you who don't know, was one of the cornerstones of Abe's election campaign and his initial popularity. He came into power promising to restart the Japanese economy, and Abenomics was how he was going to go about it. And basically, Abenomics consisted of 3 core ideas. He referred to them as 3 arrows of Abenomics. And so the first arrow of Abenomics was monetary easing, which effectively involved the government pumping huge amounts of new money into the economy. And the idea behind that was it was going to raise inflation. The target was to raise inflation to 2%, which in its own right would not lead to sustainable growth, but with the support of the other 2 arrows, it would eventually lead to a more sustained economic growth for Japan. The second arrow was fiscal stimulus, which basically involved greater government consumption, the government putting more money into the economy itself, in terms of purchasing and also in terms of lowering taxes, and basically encouraging people to spend more money, getting people to go out and consume more goods, and to basically just put more money into the economy, which it effectively undermined before it had even begun by raising consumption tax, which is, some people would know it more as VAT, and it's this tax that is added to goods that people go out and buy in the shops and in restaurants and what have you, and effectively drives the cost of those goods up, and therefore effectively can make people less likely to buy those goods, which was completely counterintuitive to this second arrow of fiscal stimulus. And although raising the consumption tax had always been a part of the government's long-term plan, Abe effectively brought it in much earlier than most people thought he would, which undermined his second arrow. And then the third arrow was that of structural reform, and this is where Abenomics never really got off the ground. The first arrow, monetary easing, that has happened on a large scale on multiple occasions since Abe came into power, and is primarily responsible for this sort of these occasional spikes in growth. The second arrow, fiscal stimulus, has happened in part, but has often been undermined. And the third arrow, structural reform, has just never really happened. Structural reform involves things like changing regulations in the private sector, making it easier for new companies to challenge the status quo. Part of Japan's great success in the 70s and 80s was that its huge conglomerates, things like Sony, Panasonic, all the big brands, Toyota, Nissan, that we know around the world as sort of synonymous with Japanese business success. They were allowed by the government, they were encouraged by the government and sort of aided by the government to sort of grow and spread their wares across the world, and that export-driven economy really took off in the 70s and 80s and led to Japan's great economic miracle. However, over the last 20 years, many of these companies have become stagnant. Business practices have lacked dynamism and creativity, and new up-and-coming challenges really can't get going. Japan has always had a culture of retired bureaucrats and civil servants going and working at these giant multinational companies, and there's just been this entrenched status quo that has stagnated along with the Japanese economy over the last few years, and effectively made it very difficult for the economy to reinvent itself. And then you add to that other manifold problems within the Japanese economy, such as a lack of women in the workforce, which Abe has promised many times to try and address and has completely failed to do so. Japanese women have entered the workforce in greater numbers. It was up to 43% of the workforce was made up of women by 2014, but unfortunately only 9% of those women were in managerial positions, which speaks to a greater problem, which is that most Japanese women feel or are made to drop out of the workforce at the moment they decide to have children. Company hiring practices make it very difficult effectively for a woman to re-enter the workforce, or at least at the same level, stage of their career as before they had children. A number of other factors contribute to that as well. There's a lack of proper daycare facilities and such to look after children if women do want to re-enter the workforce. So that's been a problem. There has been a huge rise in irregular employment. The old lifetime employment system that Japan was much vaunted for in the past has started to give way. It's no longer economically feasible to give people jobs for life, and so regular employment has started to dwindle or at least decrease, and irregular employment is on the rise. And those are not jobs that give people the opportunity or ability to go out and spend money and stimulate the economy. And then there's also, of course, the fact that Japan is a very low immigration country. Japan remains 98% Japanese. Although immigration numbers have gone up slightly in recent years, it still tends to be low-skilled workers coming from China, the Philippines, who are taking on jobs that again don't really stimulate the economy. And with Japan's population, as many of you will know, is shrinking, a lack of immigration as well makes it all that more difficult for the economy to grow sustainably over the long term. So those, as I see it, are some of the main reasons why I believe that the current growth in the Japanese economy is really not much more than a false dawn. It looks good on paper. Some economists are arguing that it's boosted by an increase in capital spending and investment with the 2020 Olympics coming up, and that's certainly going to be a part of it. But again, that's a short-term situation. The next 3 years we'll see a lot more money come into Japan in the build-up to and the time surrounding the Olympics. But once that goes away, then no doubt we'll see those old problems return, unless Abe or whoever succeeds him can succeed in implementing those reforms that Abenomics has so spectacularly failed to follow through on. So that's just a bit of context to these stories that have been going around, and to just give a little bit more of an idea of what I feel is the reality behind this spike in growth. So anyway, I'm going to include below, in the description below, I'm going to include some links to the story about this recent growth spike, as well as links to academic articles for those of you who can access them, and general newspaper reports and analysis of Abenomics and the reforms that it was supposed to bring and that it failed to bring, and just sort of a bit of background information on some of the social and cultural and political factors that have led me to believe that this is only going to be a short-term spike in growth. So thanks for watching. I hope some of you found this video interesting. If any of you have any counterpoints or counter-arguments, please leave them in the comments below, or go out and make your own video. Or if you have any questions about some of the things that I've said that don't get covered in the articles that I'm going to provide, please feel free to leave a comment or send me an email, or do whatever. I'd love to have a debate or a discussion about this with anyone who's interested. So thanks for watching again, and I'll see you in the next video.